time for the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by RenegadeRiver.com. And now your host, Mike Hewitt. Good morning, Mike.
Hey, good morning, Brian Thomas. And with us in riding shotgun again, Mr. Jim Riley. Welcome.
Good morning.
Listen, we've got a pretty packed-up show today, which is a great thing. First on with us is a former chairperson of the U.S. Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and also an author of Architects of Disaster and the Destruction of Libya. Welcome, Pete Hoekstra, to the Mike Hewitt Show.
Hey, Mike, good morning. Good to be with you.
Listen, I really appreciate you coming on with us with short notice, Pete. And I was I was joking a little bit. I reached out to the fellow that you work with, and I say I'm looking for someone that has a background in intelligence that can help me try to discern what's really going on in Syria and Paris and so forth. And I think he knew I was teasing a little bit. He says, I got Pete Hoekstra. Will that work? I said, yeah. Golly, I didn't even think of that. So it was a fun exchange. All jokes aside, though, we're watching some pretty catastrophic events go on in the world right now. And in fact, we had you on less than a month ago, and it seems like things are worse now by far than they were even just then.
They really are. If you take a look at what ISIS has been able to accomplish just in the last 3 weeks, taking down an aircraft in Sinai, a plane that left Egypt, and they took it down over the Sinai Peninsula. Right after that, they took down, or they had a pair of suicide bombings in Beirut that killed dozens of people. Injured hundreds of people. Then you have the Paris attack, and then you have the roundup, whatever that is going to show that was going on last night and this morning. It really tells you that ISIS has extended its reach, and rather than just talking about ISIS, because there's different groups that claim responsibility for these attacks, but the bottom line is they are all radical jihadists. They're sometimes competing, but they have a whole lot more in common than what separates them.
What concerns me, Pete, and I'm obviously a novice in this arena, but when I look at the layout of the geography that they control, the amount of assets and revenue stream that they've got coming in, I say they, I mean ISIS, and that general region that is no longer under traditional government control. What concerns me greatly is it appears to me that the Obama administration is treating these folks like criminals, and in reality, they're a pretty well-funded nation group. Am I overstating it?
No, I mean, you're exactly right. The strategy used to be that we would do anything and everything that we could to make sure that the first thing that the terrorists had to think about in the morning was whether they could survive that day. We would always have the pressure on them wherever they were, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen. They had to worry about whether a special operations force from the U.S. Or whether a drone or one of our manned aircraft would be hitting them that day, because they knew that we were watching them with our intelligence, and when we found them, most likely we would kill them because it was impossible to go in there and to capture them. And now they've got ungoverned areas. They control Libya, or they don't control it. Libya is an ungoverned state.
Right.
Syria and Iraq are ungoverned states, and in both of those, or all three of those countries, ISIS controls lots of territory, and until the Russians and the French started actually going after them aggressively, they could wake up in the morning thinking about how they were going to control the area that they were administering, and thinking about, hey, how do we attack Paris, London, Europe, and the West? They can't do that anymore.
No, I see a lot of speculation that Paris was a practice run for an attack in the United States. Are you seeing anything in that regard?
I wouldn't. I'm not sure it was a practice run. It was but clearly they continue to learn and to modify their operational plans and techniques. And I think they know that there's differences between Europe and the United States. But sure, ultimately their intent is to hit the United States They've made that very clear with the communiques that have come out since their attack in Paris and the stuff that they've been saying for years. You know, it's nice to hit Europe, it's nice to hit Paris, it's nice to hit London, but the brass ring that they're reaching for is to attack the United States, most likely in New York or Washington.
Right. One of the things I did in preparation for the show, Pete, is I frankly spent a couple hours last night Googling and also searching Facebook. And what I was looking for is kind of across the political spectrum here in the United States for what people are thinking, whether it was from the very right all the way across to the very left. And the one thing that it was really common is that nobody really seems to understand what strategy the United States is employing right now. Of course, everyone's got different theories about what we should do, and that kind of is typical for the spectrum I was looking for, but everyone seemed to be confused about what we are actually doing. What do you think?
That's because, I mean, when you find the left and the right agreed on anything, you can pretty much assume that is now, that is truth. And it is true. You know, Dianne Feinstein, the Democrat lead on the Senate Intelligence Committee, she has come out and said, we're not aggressive enough. Left wing from California, and then obviously it's not hard to find a Republican conservative who's in disagreement with the president's strategy. But,
Pete, can I just jump in on this? Because one thing that gets me is there have been plenty of books and novels, written about ISIS or terroristic attacks on soft targets in the United States. Some suggesting that, the 6, 7, 8, 10 little groups of folks in the United States going after elementary schools purely for the terror end of it. That these are novels. But what we saw here in Paris was the soft targets, multiple targets on the same day, not so much looking to kill masses of people, although clearly they succeeded at that, but again to create terror. It seems to me that the reason that we haven't had this kind of an event in the United States is because, for the most part, the United States has been able to keep these bad people out of our country, out of our continent. Europe is different because they can just walk across borders. I'm very fearful with this concept of the massive unvetted expansion of, quote, refugees coming into our country. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think the refugee crisis is not solved by bringing these people into Europe and bringing them into the United States. Personally, and I want to be clear here, the information coming into the vetting process, I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the quality of the information by which you are going to vet these people. When it's garbage going into the system, you're not going to get a good answer coming out. We don't know who these people are. They're coming, by definition, they're coming from ungoverned regions, which means there's no infrastructure, there's no database that you can go to and say, hey, John's trying to get into the United States. Over the last 3 years, he's gotten 3 speeding tickets. He's gotten 1 drunk driving ticket. He's a petty criminal, but that's it. Someone else says, hey, this other guy's got a clear record. And then a third person, this woman, she was affiliated with jihadi groups. That information, that database does not exist. So we can't vet these people. We don't know who they are. The second point is it's going to take, Josh Earnest was on TV, the president's spokesperson, saying, it takes 18 to 24 months before these people will ever come to the United States. So it's not about how long it takes to vet them. It's about the quality of the information. And if it's going to take 2 years, then let's clear out the areas that ISIS controls so those people can go home.
Amen.
The Kurds just liberated Sinjar City, a city and a region that, that used to house 400,000 people. The people fled when ISIS took control. This is now 400,000 people that can go back home. Now, this city has to be rebuilt and those types of things. But let's liberate the territories, help these people rebuild, and help them go home.
It would seem to me, Pete, that it would be much more on a human level, much more reasonable, and also on a financial level to build safe zones or refugee camps at whatever level of accommodation was necessary, rather than trying to import these folks into the United States and put them into communities where, to your point, that they're entirely unvetted from nation states that roughly don't exist.
But isn't that, though, isn't this, to me, the greatest fear is that there appears to be a great misunderstanding as to who has the supreme unaffected power here. What we're reading, what I'm reading here in Muskegon, Michigan, is that the president can wave a wand and bring people in here. Is that truly the case?
Well, the federal government can. The governors really are not in much of a position to stop people coming into the country. I applaud Governor Snyder for saying, maybe it's time to put this on hold and for us to wait before we take any more refugees into Michigan. But if the federal government determines that we're going to take 1,000 refugees and resettle them in Michigan, there's really not much the governor can do.
Pete, can Congress defund that effort?
Absolutely. Congress has to by the end of the first week in December. They've got to pass a spending bill, which I think will last for most of 2016. But they can put into that bill. They can put in no funds shall be expended to resettle refugees or displaced persons from Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Northern Africa. Sure, the Congress can put that language into a bill, and there'll be no money in that bill for the president to carry out an executive order. That is the most effective tool that Congress has, which is defunding the president.
Tell me this, Pete, if looking at it from a broader level for a moment, what do you think is the best strategy going forward to deal with what's going on in Syria? What do you believe the United States should be doing?
Well, there's a couple of things. I was quite surprised. I was watching one of the TV shows this morning, and one of the more liberal commentators was saying, why isn't the United States doing what Russia and what the French are doing? Isn't it kind of ironic that the French get attacked on Saturday, and then on Sunday and Monday they go out and they take out an ISIS munitions dump, they take out a recruiting center and a training camp. And you sit there and say, wow, we've been bombing for more than a year. How can these things still exist?
The worst part about that, Pete, is I think that we gave them the information of where those facilities were located, meaning we've known it and didn't act on it.
Right. So the number one is an aggressive air campaign and bringing in anybody that will help us, whether it's the Russians, whether it's the French, whether it's Brits. The Canadians have run. They're no longer part of this coalition. But, if we get the French, the UK, the Russians and us and the Jordanians, we will have a robust air force to go and attack them from the air. Then equip our allies on the ground. The Kurds and the Sunnis in Iraq, they can take back Iraq probably in a couple of months. Exactly
that. I've had the president of the National Assembly from Syria, the Kurdish Assembly of Syria, and he's been a guest on the show several times. But his frustration and this is, I'm not trying to make a political party statement here, folks, but this guy's assessment was that when George Bush was in office, the White House had an open door to find out to listen to what the Kurdish positions were and needs were to keep the vacuum filled, for lack of better words, and that once the Obama administration took over, the door was permanently slammed in their face. And the alarming part of the guy telling us that is that the Kurdish population has been the most consistent ally of the United States, not just for the decades, but for a millennia. It's alarming to me that we're not purposely supporting and arming those folks to fight on our behalf and on their own behalf.
Well, the president made a choice, okay? The president and this administration made a choice when they came into office that the most important thing for them to do was to get a nuke deal with Iran. And so why are they signing why are they not siding with the Kurds? Well, to get a new deal with Iran, they have to be friends with Iran. To be friends with Iran, you have to support the Shia government in Baghdad, the corrupt Shia government in Baghdad that has been stifling the Kurds and has been stifling the Sunnis. And so that's why they made the decision, because they wanted to get a deal with Iran, and so they've had to, when they were forced to make choices as to who they would align with and who they would not align with, they decided to align with the corrupt government in Baghdad rather than with the Sunnis and the Shias who were absolutely willing to go out and fight ISIS.
So that's an attempt at legacy building rather than standing by our allies and, frankly, the safety of the United States.
Well, I mean, obviously the president would argue that getting a nuclear agreement with Iran is for the long-term security and safety of the United States. Now, I disagree with that. I think it's a terrible agreement, and I think the sacrifices that he had to make to get to that agreement by not supporting the Kurds and Sunnis and letting ISIS metastasize throughout northern Africa and the Middle East, that's a much more dangerous and a much more imminent threat to us than anything from Iran. Now, you could make maybe a more legitimate case for the president's strategy if we really had a good agreement with Iran where they, created up their nuclear program, they paid reparations to the people who suffered under their previous terrorism activities, and they actually became an ally in fighting radical jihadists. But that's not what we saw.
So very, very fearsome and frustrating. Pete Hoekstra, we're out of time, but listen, before we go, I want to ask you a couple questions that are unrelated, and it's back to the book work that you're doing. Seems like when we talked before, you mentioned that the funds that were raised from the sale of your book, where do those funds go?
They all go to the Investigative Project on Terrorism, the organization that really has been on the forefront for the last 20 years in terms of identifying this threat from radical Islam, both abroad and right here in the United States. They've briefed the FBI. Matter of fact, our founder, Steve Emerson, was called in to brief law enforcement officials over the weekend after the Paris attacks, talk to them about the things and the insights that we had about what was going on here in the United States. So all proceeds from the book go to the Investigative Project on Terrorism.
Listen, and folks, I've read the book. It's extremely, first off, it's very well written, and the information is just, it was an eye-opener for me.
It's an easy read, and it's also now on Kindle, which it wasn't when we spoke before.
Right. Architects of Disaster, the Destruction of Libya, folks. Truly, truly, if you're trying to get your head around this, that's foundational in helping you figure out where we're at. Pete Hoekstra, thank you very, very much for joining us again.
Hey, always good to be with you guys. Have a good day.
Okay, folks, we will be right back.
And now back to the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by RenegadeRiver.com. Mike, what's going on? What's going on with your guest?
I don't know.
Your next guest.
Live radio is so much fun, but listen, Jim Riley said he's going to fill in. It's going to cost 2 extra donuts, so it's going to be okay.
What do you mean extra donuts? We've been living in a donut vacuum here for months. Two donuts may at least be a start. It will certainly not be the ultimate in satisfaction. But hey, we do have big things going on.
Yes, we really, really do. What I tell you, what we can do though, we can flip the Enigma report around with this, assuming that at some point she will ring in.
And by she, you mean because you do have on deck, we hope, a very interesting host.
Noreen Enwia, if I'm saying the name correctly, will be the guest at some point. She's an Syrian-American activist, been fighting to stop persecution of Christians and fellow minorities in the Middle East. Yeah, it looks like...
And she may be on the phone right now.
Yeah, we do have a line lighting up, so let's go to the caller. Good morning, this is the Mike Hewitt Show.
Yeah, hi, this is Dick Manishari calling in.
Hey, Dick, you don't sound like Noreen whatsoever, but that's okay, you're welcome. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing okay. Actually, I do not sound like Noreen, nor do I have all of her really important experience, but we certainly can talk about my experience learning from her and learning from the Chaldeans that I've gotten to know.
You can help me answer some of the questions I was wrestling with, and that is, it seems like, and listen, by the way, just so everyone knows, I am 100% behind immigration and absolutely believe that the United States has a responsibility to help with refugees. I don't at all agree with the way it's being handled. I would much rather see the United States invest itself in creating safe zones and refugee camps within Syrians' borders, so that they can at some point help to rebuild their country. To me, I believe that is the right course, but obviously it's not President Mike. But those issues aside, and I'm not wanting to turn this into a race topic, or not race, but religion topic. But when I look across, it feels like the news is filled with how we need to help the Muslims. And by the way, I think that there's some truth to that. There's a difference, I agree, between a radical, crazy Islamist versus a person who's a practicing peaceful Muslim. But it's one of the reasons I was excited about having Noreen on is to talk about the fact that there's a lot of persecution of Jews and Christians and several other religious sects, and it feels like the entire media and our government is absolutely ignoring that. Am I wrong?
Well, I think that's a really important point strategically. I mean, you look at the understatement of the personal experiences of people in Nineveh, which is Mosul. I think originally it was a new name, but the towns. So I think, this understated internationally. The Pope doesn't really talk about it. I mean, the Pope came to America and spent time talking about social justice in lots of ways, and really didn't stress what's happening in the Middle East to Christians, to Catholics, for example, Chaldean Catholics. So I think, but if you look at the whole notion of just downplaying Christianity, whether it's in America and the way things are covered, just the number of times the president talks about how important it is to be aware of Islam and its contributions to the country. There's definitely a shadow being placed on Christians, and when it comes to even Christians who are losing their lives as martyrs, that's certainly part of it.
Yeah, for me, very candidly, a person's a human. I don't particularly care what their faith is if they're a peaceful human. And I think that when we look at setting up refugee camps or helping people, we're helping people. We're not picking our favorite faith of the month and saying those are the folks we're going to help to the detriment of everyone else in the region. I just think that's so wrong-headed. And when I look at the allies that the Obama administration seems to be setting itself up with or aligning the United States with, it feels like all of these folks that we're aligning ourselves with have a religious interest, period, to the detriment of everyone else. We're putting blinders on and pretending we're not seeing Christian persecution, and where they're taking them out in the streets and burning them and hanging them, and it's silence. It's not being spoken of. Mike, to me, that's disgusting.
When I was a kid, the first thing I remember in my training as a child was the notion of what a martyr was, and we learned about martyrs, and this was a Catholic environment, but we learned of them, and they were the model for people. Well, we have martyrs who are dying every day in the Middle East, in the Christian communities, and we don't hear a word about them, not even as an example of somebody who was so committed that they would let somebody take themselves or their families rather than lose their faith. That's an idea that doesn't even seem to have any meaning. And I guess the opposite is true. Let's go the other way. We really have information, detailed information, I think, that, the quote, the Christians, churches, which are really very, very infiltrated by the left at this point, are in the business of moving people from the refugee camps into America, knowing that the refugee camps that the UN has are by just the way it works, they are empty of Christians. If you're a Christian and you're put into a refugee camp, unfortunately, the harassment, including physical threats and even physical harm, drives the Christians out of the UN camps. So by definition, when the UN says these are the refugees, America, that your State Department should take, there are very, very few Christians in those camps. So 97%, for example, of the Syrians coming into Michigan and into the United States are, in fact, Muslim.
Right.
And people moving them into the towns in Michigan are, in fact, primarily the Lutheran Services Organization in Troy and other places, and out on the western side as well, and the Catholic Bishops Catholic Bishops Conference. So these organizations are knowingly moving large numbers of Sharia practicing Muslims into Michigan. So it's not just a question of not taking Christians; it's a question of aggressively moving people who have a different value system. I'm not talking about religion now.
It is, but Dick, I agree with you. But my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that none of these numbers are about faith, nor are they about helping people in the form of a refugee, but rather they're about money, and that there's money being made on a massive scale, tied to each head that's being transferred.
I was in a meeting last night, and somebody was asking that question, and I pulled out a book by Jim Simpson, who's written a book, and on Table 20.
He's been a guest on the show, by the way, an extremely knowledgeable man. So
his book is called Red Green Axis, and I recommend it. It's on the website that we've just built for Michigan on refugee resettlement. But in one column, it shows that since 2008, the Catholic Bishops Conference has received $2 billion of taxpayer money from the State Department for one only purpose, and that is to pick up bodies and move them into the United States and deposit them into cities. And then the only other role they have is to connect those people to welfare, federal welfare, but very, very importantly, also to fill out the paperwork for state welfare. So the $2 billion into one organization, the Catholic Bishops Refugee Resettlement Program, $2 billion of taxpayer money, not charitable contributions by people in the pews, taxpayer money, to just move bodies into America and to get paid for it. That is the same organization who has enough money to lobby for more refugees.
Who's driving? Dick, who's driving this agenda?
Well, I think there's different people driving it. Certainly, I'd have to say, we by the way, we did see a movie last night called Agenda 2. I recommend that for everybody. The churches basically have been infiltrated by the left, just like the media, just like the universities, and so the whole notion of social justice takes, if you really look at it, it takes a very strange perspective that somehow it is the church's job to repopulate America with the third world, and basically to redistribute wealth. And one of the ways you redistribute wealth is to redistribute people.
Right.
So there's this massive movement in the state of Michigan. We know 27,851 human beings have been moved into Michigan by the Lutheran Church, the Catholic Church, and a few other groups into Michigan in the last 8 years. And the funny thing, not funny at all, they've been moved into 120 towns. The people in those towns, including the mayors and the sheriffs, don't know anything don't know that they were moved. Last night I heard that last night the White House refused to tell the governors where the Syrians have been placed or would be placed.
I watched Chris Christie on an interview last night as governor of New Jersey, and they've gotten a significant population of Syrian refugees moved into his state already. And he said exactly that. He said they've absolutely not communicated with the governor's administration whatsoever, either him or anyone within his administration. I find that just alarming. Of course, I read all over the place where this is not this is a matter of constitutional law, that this has to be done at a federal level. But the idea that the states are not being informed tells you it really goes to some really serious infrastructural political alignment problems that we're having in the United States. What I'm slowly driving at is we've almost got no states left. It's just a big, gigantic monolith of a central government.
Well, it's more, and that central government is directly connected to outside forces. So here's a great example of totalitarianism. I mean, this is a new way of life. This is totalitarianism. If the governors cannot get information from the White House and the State Department about where the refugees are being placed, having not acknowledged that we have a terrorist issue where just one Syrian can be placed and they don't know about it. So here, let me give you an example. But to me, that's just a terrible sign for every American about totalitarianism already in play. How about the state of Michigan? In the state of Michigan, God bless, I'm very happy that the governor stood up and said, no more Syrians, take a break. Gary Glenn issued a proposal on that. Jim Runstad has 2 new bills in Congress about that. But let's back up a minute. Last year, if the governor was concerned about the potential for one Syrian terrorist to come in through the refugees, and he said stop, that's great. However, last week, last month, and last 12 months, 180 Syrians have come into the state of Michigan. I only know that because we issued a FOIA request.
Listen, I got to tell you on that note, if these folks had been properly vetted and were truly in need of asylum, I'd be saying great, but I certainly can't look into Governor Snyder's heart and see what he feels on these topics. But to bring these folks in without the ability to vet them, we had former Congressman Pete Hoekstra on in the first segment of this show today and talked about exactly that. There's no possible way to vet these folks, and to do that is shrugging off the first responsibility of both state and federal government, and that's to protect the citizenry. You take a limited government guy like me, when I look at what is the actual role of state and federal government, its first one is just to protect the citizens. And to do this without being able to vet them is beyond the pale.
So, Mike, listen, so they were not vettable.
Right.
Pete said that. They were not vettable last year, and we brought them in. In addition to that, when I asked the question directly to the Office of Refugees who work for the governor, they said, we do not have that information. We don't have access to the documents. Under Freedom of Information request, which is an official way, they would have broken the law if they didn't respond. They did respond. In the documentation on our website, I can find 180 times when refugees from Syria last year were brought into the state of Michigan. What they did is they covered up the towns they went to.
Right.
So even now, if there's one potential terrorist in 180 people in Michigan towns, how could that happen without the sheriff knowing? I mean, and as of this moment, if the governor's saying they're not vettable, we must stop. Anybody watching the 180 people who came in from Syria last year? Right. Do the sheriffs know them? Do they go to mosques? I got to tell you, Dick, I don't know what the governor is saying now. My interpretation is, and that's all it is, my interpretation is that he believed at one point that they were being vetted. And I of course, I don't know those things. You can only guess that.
It's one thing to say that you know they're vetted. It's another thing to make sure. It's one thing for some government functionary to say, oh, yeah, trust us, I'm from the government, we're doing the right thing. The part that makes it really difficult to swallow, and again, I commend the governor for speaking up today, but when you ask a question of the agency in charge of refugees in the state, and I'm reading the quote right now, these contracts are between the resettlement agencies and the State Department, and as such, this office, meaning the Michigan Office of Refugees, does not have access to those documents. So there's no reason to lie. Sure. That was a direct quote, and that same agency just sent me, or sent our we're a group of citizens, the documents. So I'm just saying, it's scary because the Lutheran services and the Catholic bishops in Michigan know, because they're moving the bodies. The state has a record of every arrival by every refugee, the date. I see it right now. I'm looking at the document. The date they arrived in Michigan, what country they came from, Syria, for example, 180 times out of 3,000 people last year, and the agency that moved them. So they have all that information.
Does your information, Dick, identify what cities and communities that they went to?
Okay, so they send that whole spreadsheet. I have 3,015 lines. The column that's covered up that they won't show me is the place they went.
Right.
And when specifically asked, the simplest of simple questions, do you have the information? They lie. That is their public policy, to lie to people like you and to everyone else in this country.
I've got the same kind of quote directly from the woman who runs the Troy Agency for Lutheran Services. I have it in writing. We do not make plans. You need to check with Lansing. The Lansing I mean, the gentleman has a name. He's an employee of the state of Michigan. He is the head of refugees. His name is Al Horn. He reports to the head of Health and Human Services, who reports to the governor. Anyway, this woman who's in charge of Lutheran Services, I have that email, also said, we don't have that information. Check with Lansing. Lansing gave me the answer. They don't have it. And now under Freedom of Information, we have the document. So the website is Refugee Resettlement monitormichigan.org, and all the documents are published there. So people can do their own homework. Even though they sent the documents, they covered up the cities where these people are.
Sure. Dick, if you have the contact information for Al Horn, please forward it over to me, because I'll reach out to him and ask him to come on the show. And if he says no, I'll tell the folks what he said in his reason for not wanting to come on the show and talk about these things.
I'll send that to you right away. By the way, we visited with a few representatives on the way to this point we're at now. These are Lansing representatives and senators.
Right.
They were quite upset that we didn't get the information from Al Horn. So I will send you that note, and it would be great to get Al Horn to talk to the public and answer the question: why are these things kept secret?
Right. Listen, Dick. We're out of time, but do the listeners a favor. Tell them what's the address for your website. How can folks find this information you've collected up for them?
Okay, it's a relatively new website. It's I'm going to give it to you. It's Refugee Resettlement monitormichigan.org.
That's a big handle, Dick.
Yeah, I know, but
okay.
And you know what? We're piling data in there,
yep.
And so people can check out. There's a tab on the top that says FOIA documents. You know everything we know. It's out there.
Dick, all jokes aside, thank you very, very much for what you're doing.
Thank you, Mike, for putting topics like this on the air.
Listen, I appreciate you calling in and filling in for Noreen, and we'll have you on again.
All right, thank you.
Great. Folks, we'll be right back after all these wonderful messages.
And now back to the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by RenegadeRiver.com. And we have made it to that point of the show. Some of us look forward to it, other of us wonder what's around the corner. But it is the Enigma Report.
No,
what lurks around the corner?
Folks, I wish you could see his smile when he gets done with that introduction. He's like a 12-year-old at Christmas when he's done. Listen, the Enigma Report today is kind of last week we ran out of time. So we got pushed up. The only thing we were able to do is find out that Jim Riley and I didn't agree on something, and that wasn't overly shocking. But here's the enigma for me. It's about money and politics. I've got a picture that hangs in my office that is of a town somewhere in America. I don't know where, but it's a courthouse or the clerk's office. It looks like an old-fashioned courthouse. And standing on the steps of the courthouse, there's two politicians. And it looks like the entire town is standing in the street. They're listening to the two politicians run their spiel. And then the town is going to go vote. That's what the image represents. And so nowadays, we've come from that scene, that image where the entire town piles out to listen to these folks. Now we're down to an extraordinarily embarrassing low eligible voter turnout. And in my mind, the gap that has been replaced by the gap that's been left by voters' lack of interest has been big money corporations, big money PACs, big money has filled that gap. That's my view of it. Maybe I'm all wet, but that's how I see it. So to me, there's a balance. On one hand, you can have everybody involved that ought to be and can be legally involved, eligible voters, get involved in the process, pay attention to the candidates, look up from your iPads for a minute or your iPhones, and pay attention to what's going on, and then vote your conscience. Even if I disagree with you passionately, I call on you to get involved and pay attention and vote. That's what America really, that's the strength in us, is an informed and virtuous society. And when we have an absence of an engaged society, we have the vacuum filled with people with interests that are not necessarily with the people's interests, and that's where you see big money. What do you think, Jim?
Well, you keep mentioning big money, and I think a lot of folks maybe miss your point. The simple reality is, and you asked the question, I don't think we got a good, clear answer. What is driving this push for refugees from all over the world, because we happen to be just focusing on Syrian refugees, but the United States has been bringing refugees in from many, many other countries for decades and decades. What's driving this? Well, perhaps there may be a little bit of guilt in the sense that we are a very prosperous country and we should be maybe doing our part, and that's a legitimate point. But the real driver is money. There are human beings who are actually making the millions upon millions of dollars, billions, and actually over time probably in the trillions in the refugee business. Now, there are 9 major resettlement contractors who determine the future of your cities and states here in the United States. They call themselves voluntary agencies, and these are the groups who get incredible amounts of federal money to process these refugees from all over the country, or from all over the world. And this is driven by money. And just like we saw with the green energy, the Solandras and other companies who got huge amounts of grants from the federal government and subsequently went bankrupt shortly thereafter, they gave back millions upon millions of dollars in political campaign money, almost entirely to Democrats, by the way. These 9 VOLAGs, the voluntary agencies, have very little to do with religious organizations. They are businesses, and they give millions and millions of dollars back in political contributions, mostly to Democrats. It's driven by money. When these refugees arrive in the United States, they don't speak the language. They have no sense of what our culture is. They are virtually unemployable. In many cases, they're very, very sick. They will be wards of the state in great likelihood for the rest of their lives.
I got to tell you, I think that the part that... First off, I agree with everything you said for the most part, but except for the why part. The why part was absent from your spiel. When you look at the big, gigantic blobs of money that are being engaged, I know why people are doing it. They're getting paid to do it. If you come to Renegade River, I'm going to make a little bit of money if you buy a firearm or a holster or some ammo from me, and that's my motivation. I'm there to make money. So I get why the Catholic Bishops Association, the Lutheran, I get that why they're doing it. They're after money. But when I stop and say, where's the money coming from and why is it taking place?
Coming from the federal government.
Well, but there's a reason. We got to get to the why part. Why is really important here. There's 2 reasons in my view, and you might not agree with both, or maybe you will. But the first of the 2 reasons is part of its population. We're not having enough of a birth rate to maintain our numbers in the United States. We just simply aren't. And that's true, by the way, in most of the Western culture countries. And so the government, whoever sits at the top of the pile, the people probably frankly beyond the government, and they look and say, okay, we're not having enough population to support this monolith of a government we've built, which is our actual agenda, at least domestically, and so they import people, pretend that there is a border wall, even though we know there's not. And like I've said many times in the show, 11 million people didn't sneak across a border. That just is stupid to even say that. They were welcome. We've actually run a political campaign to cause these people to want to come here. Those things are not happening. So in my view, the first of the reasons is to fill a vacuum left by a population that is not replenishing itself. The second one, though, goes to a little bit of a darker cause, and that is globalization. When I wrote America's Final Beginning, and I did a lot of research in this area, and now I'm fairly close to the end of writing The Third Founding of America, the sequel to the first. And listen, folks, they're both fiction novels, so don't misunderstand what I'm telling you. But to do them, I had to do a lot of research. And the one thing that I found is that most of the big global money people, they want a global government. That's what. So when I look at all these billions and go, where's this money coming from? It's not all coming from the federal tax dollars. More of it is coming from the UN and shadow organizations like the 57 states that Obama referred to, but he was referring by accident to the 57 Islamic states. It's coming from those folks that want a global government.
Actually, the UN doesn't give a penny to the United States. They get billions of dollars a year.
They don't.
The reality
wait, Jim, you're wrong about that. Hang on. They don't give a penny to the United States, agreed, but they are funding some of these transfers of people.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, they support it tremendously. But let me go back to your one point, and I will disagree with you very enthusiastically. If, in fact, there is a need for workers in this country, there's an easy way to fix it. That's legal immigration. Refugee resettlement does not bring workers. There's no one in the world who thinks that refugees who do not speak our language, who have no education, who come from a different culture, in any way, shape, or form are capable or competent to fill any single job in the country. Legal immigration would fix that. The same people that you say have all this power don't seem to be interested whatsoever in increasing legal immigration.
Listen, you and I are not in disagreement on that. Frankly, the Syrian numbers in total aren't moving voter trends or anything. They're changing communities where they've been placed.
Boy, they are.
They are changing communities.
The Somalis in the Minneapolis area.
And they're giving those communities a left-leaning globalist flavor.
You bet.
And that's my point. That's when I say that's the agenda, at least as it pertains to the Syrian refugees. But in terms of the overall numbers, compared to the 325 million or so in our population, it isn't moving the needle, but it is changing some base communities. We agree on that. But somewhere between 11 and 40 million illegal immigrants in the United States is dramatically changing us, and that's not by accident.
And that's the truth, Chuck.
That's my view. 45 seconds, he says.
You're still a smart guy with flaws, significant flaws.
I haven't found any yet. Let me know. Listen, folks, I've had a fun time on the show today. It's informative. And I think the show was kind of went through a little bit of a change over the last few months, and I'm enjoying it a lot. We are almost out of time. In the meantime, find us at /The Mike Hewitt Show on Facebook or Talk Mike Hewitt on Twitter. Shoot us an email at mike@themikehewittshow.com. Thank you very much, folks. We'll see you next Wednesday.